Welcome, dear traveler. You've wandered far tonight, perhaps not through forests or foggy moors, but through the winding lanes of your own mind seeking comfort, curiosity, or simply the gentle hum of a story well told. I'm Silas Whitmore, your humble narrator of history's quieter corners. And this evening we turn not to kings or crusades, but to something far more unsettling and far more real. Picture it: the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the stale scent of spoiled grain, the faint scratching behind walls. Rats. In a world where disease lurked in every barrel and superstition clouded every explanation, there was one creature more feared than wolves, more persistent than poverty: the rat. And where there were rats, there had to be those brave or desperate enough to chase them. Tonight, we follow the ragged boots and soot-smudged faces of the medieval rat catchers, men armed not with swords or shields, but with sacks, sticks, poisons, and a stomach for the unspeakable. Their work was filthy, thankless, and often fatal. Yet they were the invisible line between chaos and collapse. In cities groaning under the weight of vermin and plague, these catchers were the last hope before the rats took everything. So dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum that makes everything feel a little safer. Let the world outside fade away and let us step softly into another time. A time of shadows and straw, of whispers and scratching paws. A time when the most dangerous job in town was chasing tails. And before we descend into the dark, if you find yourself entertained or even slightly less alone, leave a comment with the number 1. And if you didn't enjoy this at all, well, do the honorable thing and press like anyway. It keeps the rats at bay. You might think the rat catcher emerged from the margins of society, skulking into towns as an oddity. But no, he was forged in the fire of panic, born of an ancient fear, and legitimized by death itself. His profession didn't appear gently. It exploded into relevance in the 14th century when the Black Death gripped Europe like a cold hand around the throat. Before, the plague rats were just rats. Annoying, yes. Dirty, certainly. But they weren't the embodiment of apocalypse. That changed in 1347. As merchant ships docked in Sicily, carrying silks, spices, and an invisible killer rats, specifically their fleas, became messengers of doom. With each new harbor, the death toll rose, and soon the rat was no longer a pest. It was a harbinger, a curse on 4 legs. Cities reeked of decay. The dead lay in heaps. Panic blossomed like black sores. And in the midst of that horror, someone had to do something. Enter the rat catcher, not as hero, but as necessity. He was rarely welcomed, often reviled, but desperately needed. Because where he went, death seemed to follow, and if he was lucky, lessen. This was no noble calling. It didn't require knighthood letters or blessings. It required a strong stomach, fast reflexes, and a willingness to crawl through rot. The early rat catcher had no guidebook. He made it up as he went, improvising traps, baiting burrows, burning nests, or simply grabbing the creatures bare-handed. He learned through trial, error, and infection. Despite their squalor, rat catchers became familiar faces in towns and cities. Sometimes they were paid by local officials. Other times, they earned coin directly from desperate households. Mothers worried for their children, bakers protecting their grain, apothecaries hoping to keep their herbs rat-free. And every now and then, they were rewarded with bread ale, or less kindly a bucket of water to the face if the job wasn't done right. It was dirty work, dangerous work, but it was work. And in a time when half the population was buried or digging graves, that meant everything. From the darkness of the plague emerged this reluctant profession, the rat catcher, born not out of ambition, but survival. A necessary evil made flesh. A shadow walking between disease and desperation, and the very first person you'd call after you stop screaming. If you imagine a medieval city as quaint, charming, and filled with the aroma of fresh bread, allow me to correct that notion gently, of course, as you're likely preparing for slumber. A medieval city was more like a maze of chaos wrapped in mud, noise, and smell. It was not a place that whispered, but one that shouted mostly in smells. The streets were narrow, winding, and often clogged with refuse. Buildings leaned over the cobbled paths like drunkards at closing time, threatening to kiss the rooftops across the way. And underfoot, a slurry of mud, animal waste, kitchen scraps, and occasionally things better left unnamed. You didn't walk through the streets so much as you navigated them like a rat in a wet labyrinth, an irony not lost on the real rats. Because where there's waste, there's warmth. And where there's warmth, there's food. And where there's food, there's rats. Cities were rat heaven. Grain spilled from sacks. Crumbs littered doorsteps. Bones and offal were tossed into alleys without a second thought. Every tavern had a shadowy corner. Every bakery, a warm nook. Every home, a hiding place for something squeaking. But it wasn't just the mess. It was the people. Thousands of them packed into districts without plumbing or regular waste collection. The richer neighborhoods might have a chamber pot or a servant with a mop. The poor, they had gravity and windows. And so the alleys ran thick with humanity's leftovers. It is no wonder the rat catcher was in constant demand. Cities didn't just attract rats, they practically rolled out a red carpet. Markets were some of the worst offenders. Imagine open stalls groaning with meat, fish, bread, and cheese, all without refrigeration. Flies buzzed dogs, barked children, chased geese, and through it all, rats scurried. Not shy, not discreet. Bold. They'd dart across feet, vanish under carts, and even climb stalls if no one was watching. In some places, they were so common, they stopped being noticed until someone screamed. The city was a living organism, and rats were part of its bloodstream, unwanted, uninvited, but persistent. And just as the city pulsed with life, so did its underbelly. The catchers knew this terrain better than any noble ever would. They were mapmakers of the filth, cartographers of chaos. To survive in the urban jungle, one needed sharp eyes, quick hands, and an uncanny ability to not gag. And perhaps most of all, one needed to understand the mind of the rat, not as an enemy, but as a rival tenant of a shared and decaying world. If the medieval knight had his sword and the mason his trowel, then the rat catcher's arsenal was something altogether humbler and far more unnerving. These were not gleaming tools forged in royal foundries, but objects scraped together from desperation and trial and error. Every item bore the grime of 100 cellars and the scent of old death. Let us begin with the sack. Always the sack. A coarse, scratchy burlap thing that slung over one shoulder and smelled vaguely of mildew and regret. This was the rat catcher's constant companion. It held not just his catch, but his livelihood, and on bad days his shame. Rats were tossed in alive or dead, twitching or limp. The sack swayed with the rhythm of the city's filth, a mobile monument to survival. Then came the traps, primitive, yes, but clever in their own crude way. Some were simple boxes propped with sticks and baited with crusts or rancid meat. Others used iron jaws rusted and wicked that snapped with a violence disproportionate to their size. A few employed cages with swinging doors meant to catch the rats alive for bounty or in the darker market sale. Poisons were a risky favorite. Ground herbs, arsenic, or crushed glass might be stirred into food and left in the shadows. But medieval poisons were as likely to kill a child as a rodent, and a careless placement could turn public goodwill into pitchforks and torches. Still, when the rats came thick as soup, subtlety gave way to speed. And then there were the sticks, short, thick, and stained. Sometimes they were carved from yew or ash, other times just the leg of a broken stool. A rat catcher always had one at the ready, not for show, but for swift, brutal work. Rats did not wait politely to be trapped. They lunged. They bit. They ran like water through fingers. A quick hand and a good stick often meant the difference between coin in the pocket and blood on the floor. Some carried small ferrets or dogs specially trained to wriggle into tight spaces and flush out nests. These animals were scrappy and half wild, barely tame, but invaluable. And though no tool a rat catcher's nose, trained over years, could detect the telltale stench of infestation long before others noticed. Together, this motley collection formed the medieval rat catcher's toolbox, unglamorous, improvised, and reeking of survival. And while no bard would sing of them, these humble implements were as vital to the city's health as any physician's herbs or a knight's blade. There was no rat-catching school, no official guild, no standardized manual. What you had instead was a profession built on instinct, creativity, and a certain degree of sanctioned lunacy. The rat catcher was not just a man with tools, he was a performer, a strategist, and at times a fool with a death wish. Traps, as we've seen, were the first line of defense. But rats were clever. They learned. They watched from shadows, waiting to see who didn't come back. So, the catchers had to adapt to change patterns to bait differently. Some swore by cheese, others by dried fish or rotten eggs. A few had secret recipes, oils and herbs, said to tempt even the wisest rodent. Poison had its place, though it came with risk. Some rat catchers mixed their own blends, grinding toxic roots, or bartering with apothecaries for forbidden powders. They had to be careful. Too little, the rats would feast. Too much, and a neighbor's dog, or worse, a child, might be the one who perished. In more than one village, the rat catcher disappeared mysteriously after a particularly ambitious baiting effort, but nothing matched the madness of the hands-on approach. That's right, some rat catchers hunted their prey barehanded. Picture a man crawling through a cellar on all fours, ears, straining fingers, twitching, heart pounding. A sudden squeak, a rustle of straw, and then movement. He lunges. Sometimes he wins. Sometimes the rat does. It wasn't uncommon to see a catcher nursing bite scratches or fevered infections from these encounters. But to them, it was part of the dance. And then there were the smoke chasers. With a smoldering torch in hand, they'd fill an infested building with thick smoke, then station themselves at the exits with clubs, sacks, and stomping boots. As the rats poured out, coughing, squealing, blind with panic, the catcher would begin his grim harvest. 1 rat, 2 rats, 5, 10, sometimes dozens in a single night, though it came at the cost of choking lungs and singed eyebrows. The most theatrical of them, showmen at heart, turned the craft into public spectacle. Children would follow them through town. Bystanders would cheer each successful catch. One man in Prague trained a dog and a cat to work together. The cat would flush, the dog would pounce. They were said to clear an entire bakery in under an hour. Madness, yes, but calculated. Creative. The methods of the medieval rat catcher weren't just about brute force. They were about outwitting a foe who thrived in shadows and filth. And every successful catch was a tiny triumph, one less claw, one less plague, one more breath in a fragile city. It wasn't just the rats that reeked. It was everything. The job, the tools, the clothes, the very air surrounding a rat catcher carried with it a stench that clung like guilt, heavy, unmistakable, and permanent. You didn't become a rat catcher, you had delicate sensibilities. You stayed because your nose stopped protesting. The smell began in the cellars, in the dark, damp places where light dared not linger. Mold, decay, spoiled grain-wet wood, and something sour that defied description, it all fused together. Then there were the rats themselves. Alive, they smelled like fear and musk. Dead, they bloated fast in the summer heat, turning into pouches of rot with tails. Clothing became a canvas of odors. Most rat catchers wore the same coat day in, day out, thick-patched and never truly clean. It absorbed everything: smoke from torches, blood from bites, the acrid tang of panic. A seasoned coat didn't just protect from scratches, it warned others to keep their distance. One look, one whiff, and even the boldest child thought twice before asking questions. Hands were worse. Even with gloves and many worked barehanded, the fingers grew stained, nails cracked and darkened. No matter how much you scrubbed, the smell found refuge in the folds of skin, beneath the nails, in the creases of old scars. You could try soap ash vinegar or even lemon if you were lucky. It wouldn't matter. The scent of the hunt stayed. Some tried herbs, sprigs of rosemary tucked behind ears, mint crushed into collars, lavender rubbed along cuffs. Not for fashion, but survival of the social kind. To walk through a crowded market without clearing a 10-foot radius was its own small victory. Others simply accepted their fate. They were rat catchers. They stank. That was the bargain. And still, the smell had its purpose. It marked them, yes, but it also protected them. In times when diseases spread faster than gossip, people avoided contact. Few dared get too close. Even guards, tax collectors, and debtors were known to grimace and wave them through without pause. One sniff and doors opened, or shut, depending on which side you were on. Over time, the smell became a badge. Not of honor, perhaps, but of resilience. Rat catchers wore it like armor, walked with it like shadow. Because when your work meant wading into the filth, others fled. A little stink was a small price to pay for survival, and in some strange way, a sign that you were still alive. To say the medieval rat catcher was unpopular is a bit like saying the plague was inconvenient. His presence was tolerated grudgingly because he was necessary, but respected, no. Admired, certainly not. In the great social ladder of medieval towns, he stood on a rung so low it was practically underground. Somewhere beneath the butcher, well below the gravedigger, and just shy of the dung collector, you'd find the rat catcher smelling of death, trailing the cries of rats and whispers of disease. He was part of the landscape, but never quite part of the community. The baker wouldn't invite him in. The tavern keeper served him in the alley. Children taunted from a distance. And yet, when the scratching in the walls grew louder, suddenly everyone remembered his name. People feared him not because he was dangerous, but because he reminded them that danger was always near. His tools, his smell, his profession all spoke of decay, of things you wanted to forget. And so many preferred he stayed invisible until needed, like a ghost that only appeared when the rot got too loud. Ironically, it was his success that made him lonelier. A good rat catcher might clean out half a district, but by doing so, he'd also stir up old fears. What had he seen in those homes? What secrets scuttled out with the vermin rumors swirled? Some said rat catchers could curse a house by accident or on purpose. Others whispered they could speak to rats, even command them. Superstition made them both savior and suspect. Marriage prospects were slim, friendships fleeting, but some rat catchers leaned into the role, dressing oddly, speaking little, cultivating an aura of menace or mystery. If society would not embrace them, then let society step aside. After all, who else would crawl through the filth no priest dared bless? And yet, in rare moments, the rat catcher became a hero. When a plague wave passed a neighborhood untouched, or when a merchant's grain was saved from ruin, a few coins found their way to his hand. A loaf of bread, a nod of thanks, maybe even a clean shirt. Briefly, he would be seen. But only briefly. The rat catcher lived in the cracks in the spaces between society's needs and its fears. He was needed desperately, but never truly welcomed, always one squeak away from being called, and always one whiff away from being dismissed. Before science offered its answers before germ theory, microscopes, or sanitation people turned to what they had always turned to: stories, superstition, and strange concoctions whispered from grandmother to granddaughter. And when it came to rats, the imagination ran wild. Folk remedies were a patchwork of desperation and hope. Some believed rats could be driven away by certain smells: rosemary, mint, or the ever-potent rue. Housewives might sprinkle herbs at thresholds or hang bundles from beams. Others lit candles made of tallow, mixed with ash, believing the smoke would offend the vermin and drive them into the arms of the nearest rat catcher. Salt lines were popular in some regions. A circle of salt drawn around food stores was said to confuse rats, trapping them in invisible prisons. Chalk drawings shaped like stars or animal claws were etched near larders' charms against invasion. Whether it worked was anyone's guess. But to the weary and terrified, any ritual offered comfort. There were also tales. Oh, so many tales. Rats, it was said, were not just animals, but messengers, spirits of the dead, or omens of doom. Some claimed that if you saw a rat at your doorstep at dusk, someone in the house would fall ill before the next moonrise. Others believed killing a rat without saying a prayer first would invite a curse, not just fleas. Witches naturally were blamed for rat swarms. It was said they could summon vermin with whispered Latin or the burning of special herbs. One infamous tale from the Black Forest told of a woman who, after being denied bread, unleashed a tide of rats on an entire village. The grain spoiled. Children sickened. Only when she was drowned in the river did the rats vanish. Amid this swirl of fear, the rat catcher sometimes played both roles: fighter and charmer. A few claimed they knew secret chants passed down from their fathers. Others sold rat stones, small pebbles supposedly charged with power to ward off infestations, whether it was trickery, faith, or simply timing when rats left the catcher's legend grew. This blend of magic and reality blurred the line between pest control and pagan rite. In a world without certainty, the rat catcher became not just a man of action, but a figure of ritual. He knew the dark corners, the old whispers, the way to walk through a cursed room without falling ill. He didn't just battle rats. He battled fear itself with a sack, a stick, and perhaps a whispered charm muttered beneath his breath. In a world ruled by the church, where sin had weight and salvation had price, one might think that the humble rat catcher would find no place near the holy. And for the most part, he didn't. He was too close to the filth, too wrapped in the physical rot of the world, everything the sacred sought to avoid. But necessity has a way of bending even the most rigid of institutions. Though priests rarely acknowledged them from the pulpit, rat catchers were often quietly tolerated by the church. Monasteries with their stores of parchment grain and cheese were prime targets for infestations. A single rat could ruin a scripture. A nest could decimate a season's harvest. And so behind cloistered walls, whispers summoned men the church dared not name aloud. It was a delicate relationship. Rat catchers knew to keep their heads low and words fewer. They were not invited to Mass. They were not blessed, but they were paid in coin, in bread, in quiet nods through the monastery gate. Some ecclesiastics saw them as reminders of sin itself, walking parables of decay. Just as the rat festered in the shadows of the city, so too did temptation creep in the corners of the soul. A few sermons even used the imagery: drive out the rats in your home as you would the vice in your heart. Others were less poetic. One bishop in Lyon called rat catchers God's necessary disgrace. He funded their work, but refused to let them sleep on church grounds. Another abbot reportedly offered a full indulgence to any man who could clear the abbey's granary, though he rescinded it once the man's smell filled the cloister. Still, not all was disdain. Some friars, especially those of humbler orders, saw kinship in the rat-catcher's toil. The Franciscans, who embraced poverty and lived among the poor, occasionally offered shelter or even a blessing to the dirtiest of pest hunters. For Christ, one monk wrote, was not afraid to touch the leper. Why then should I fear the rat-catcher? It was rare. It was fragile. But in those brief, tender moments, the wall between dirt and divinity softened. The church may not have fully embraced the rat-catcher, but in its quiet corners, it sometimes nodded in his direction. Not as a saint, not as a sinner, but as someone somewhere in between, battling pestilence in the alleys as the monks battled it in their souls. Though the image of the medieval rat-catcher almost always conjures a hunched, grimy man with a club and a sack, history quietly, persistently leaves behind traces of another figure, the woman rat-catcher. Her story is not often told, not because it did not exist, but because it was hidden behind curtains of silence, shame, and survival. In the alleys of towns and the backyards of villages, some women took up the trade. Not out of choice, but necessity. Widows, outcasts, the destitute women, with no dowry, no protector, and no path found in rat, catching a grim sort of independence. It was dangerous, filthy, and thankless. But it paid. Sometimes with coin. Sometimes with food. Always with caution. Unlike their male counterparts, women in the trade had to be twice as clever and 3 times as quiet. They moved unseen, slipping into basements under cover of night, sweeping away nests before dawn. They used lighter tools, snares, herbs, and clever traps. Some were said to tame ferrets or cats to do their work for them. They didn't shout or boast. They survived. Their presence made people uncomfortable. A man covered in filth was distasteful. A woman covered in it was scandalous. Children stared. Neighbors whispered. Even those who hired them avoided eye contact. Yet when the rats returned, those same voices called again, this time softer, apologetic, desperate. There are scraps in parish records. A woman in York paid 2 pennies to clear a bakery cellar. A widow in Ghent who received bread and candles for clearing a bishop's grain house. A nameless girl in Prague, mentioned only as the rat girl in a merchant's journal, praised for saving a winter's supply of barley. Stories swirl too, half legend, half truth. One tells of a woman near Rouen who used only her voice, humming in low tones, said to entrance the rats into sacks. Another tells of 2 sisters in Crack W, Silent and Swift, who cleared entire neighborhoods and vanished without payment. Whether real or myth, these tales echo with possibility. Women in the trade didn't rise to fame. They didn't become folk heroes or town legends. But they endured. In the darkest corners, with the smallest tools, they pushed back against the filth, against the hunger, against the silence. They were not invited into the story, so they made their own in whispered lines, in cellar shadows, in the scurry and stillness of rats retreating. It was during the plagues, those grim parades of death, that the rat-catcher's role transformed. No longer a nuisance figure, no longer the one children mocked or tavern keepers shunned, he became something more. Something necessary. Terrifying, and for a brief, terrible moment, almost powerful. The plague did not come quietly. It arrived with a whisper, then a cough, then a death, and then another. Soon, carts rolled through the streets, filled with the still and the silent. Entire households vanished in days. Doors were marked with chalk. Streets emptied. Bells tolled not for weddings, but for mourning, and they tolled often. And through it all, skulking in alleys, ducking beneath boarded shutters, the rat catcher worked. People needed someone to blame, and while the church pointed to sin and the nobles blamed fate, the common folk looked to the rats, to their fleas, to the filth, to the nests that pulsed beneath floorboards. And so, the rat catcher became the closest thing to a protector. He was summoned more often, paid more than ever. Coin flowed like never before. In some towns, entire city watches were reassigned to assist in exterminations. Rats were hunted like wolves. Their tails were counted, piled, even paraded. Some towns held grim festivals, rat days, where catchers competed for prizes, their sacks weighed like trophies. But with visibility came suspicion. If the rat catcher could find and kill so many, why had he not done so before? Was he holding back, breeding them? Was he in league with the darkness he fought? Accusations rose as fast as corpses. Some catchers were attacked, blamed for spreading the disease. A few were lynched. Others fled, their sacks left swinging on lampposts like grim flags of failure. And still, the rats came. Those who remained grew quiet. They worked in silence, often at night, their eyes avoiding torches and crowds. The job had always been grim. Now it was lethal. But it was also vital. And in those terrible years, when the Black Death rolled like thunder over Europe, the rat catcher stood at the front lines, not armored, not adored, but present. In the end, he could not stop the plague. No sack or stick could catch the wind-borne death, but he tried. And sometimes that was all a city could ask someone who stayed. Someone who faced the scuttling dark when others ran. A figure bent and ragged, but still moving. Not a hero. Not a villain. Just a man chasing shadows in a city full of ghosts. Every trade has its season. And for the medieval rat catcher, that season was long and dark, but not eternal. As the centuries turned, and the world slowly lit its candles of reason, his shadow began to shorten. The world was changing. And with change came the quiet fading of an old and grisly calling. Science, of course, was the first crack in the foundation. With microscopes came understanding. With understanding came hygiene. Streets were paved. Sewers were dug. Waste was removed with more regularity. Rats still thrived, but they no longer swarmed unchecked. And with fewer rats came fewer calls. The church, once wary of filth, now supported more organized care. Municipal councils formed health boards. Catchers were replaced or absorbed into public works. They wore uniforms now, carried paperwork, received wages, not bread. And while some of the old-timers clung to their sacks and boots, they found themselves working under orders, not instincts. The mystery faded too. The days of whispered charms and midnight hunts began to look like superstition. People wanted men with ledgers, not lore. Sprayers, not spells. A rat was no longer a curse. It was a statistic. Something to count, not fear. For many rat catchers, this shift was bittersweet. The danger lessened. The pay improved. But the role once laced with dread danger and a certain brutal romance became mundane. They were no longer the last line before plague, but simply part of sanitation. Necessary still, but not feared, not whispered about in alleys. Some tried to hold on. They told stories in taverns about the time they cleared an abbey or outran a swarm. They showed scars, displayed old traps like relics. A few became curiosities hired by cities to demonstrate the old ways at fairs, like actors playing themselves in the theater of memory. Others simply vanished, their names never written down, their footsteps never recorded. The last of a line that began in shadow and ended in silence. And yet the city never truly forgets. In its oldest corners, where the cobblestones still smell faintly of smoke, and time, the spirit of the rat catcher lingers. Not in fear, but in respect. A memory of those who faced what others fled, who fought filth without fanfare, who disappeared when they were no longer needed. The plague ended. The profession faded. But the story remains. Today, the rat catcher is a job you rarely think about unless you hear a scratch behind your walls. Then just for a moment, that ancient fear returns, that primal twitch in your spine. And suddenly you remember that even in this age of glass and steel, the shadows have not vanished, only shifted. Modern pest control technicians wear clean uniforms and carry clipboards. They drive trucks with logos and offer guarantees. Their tools are digital, their methods regulated. There is no sack, no stick, no whispered charm. And yet somewhere beneath the professionalism lingers the ghost of their medieval ancestor. In the cautious way, they listen. In the quiet moments before setting a trap. In the knowledge that the smallest, most unseen things can cause the greatest havoc. That legacy has not disappeared. It has evolved. Some cities still hold on to echoes of the past. In Hamelin, Germany, you can still find tributes to the Pied Piper, the most famous of all rat catchers, fictional or not. Statues, songs, and even festivals remember the flute player who led the rats and children away. A cautionary tale wrapped in melody and myth. In literature, film, and dreams, the rat catcher endures. Sometimes as a villain, sometimes a savior, often both. He represents the part of humanity that dives into darkness to protect the light. A figure half forgotten, half feared, yet always near. And there are still those who work in silence. In forgotten towns or aging cities, a man or woman climbs into an attic, checks behind a wall, sets a baited trap. They don't carry torches, but they carry knowledge. They don't deal with plague, but they deal with risk. And they walk a thin line between the clean surface of daily life and the unseen crawl beneath it. They may not call themselves rat catchers. They may never have heard the stories. But in every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of paper at night, the old tale stirs. The reminder that civilization is only ever a few scratches away from chaos. And so the legacy remains not in the smell or the scars or the whispered names, but in the quiet resilience of those who still answer the call, who still face what others flinch from, who stand broom in hand between order and ruin. Not for glory, not for praise, just because someone must. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of this curious journey through shadowed alleys and time-worn cellars where history wore a grimy cloak and carried a rat sack on its shoulder. We did not walk with kings tonight, nor dine in candlelit halls. Instead, we crouched beside the forgotten. We followed those who were never meant to be remembered, and yet somehow still are. Rat catchers, those grim custos. They walked between the cracks of society, between plague and order, between what we fear and what we must face. They were never praised, rarely paid well, often blamed, but they remained. They endured the filth so others didn't have to. And in doing so, they became something more than men with sticks. They became symbols of that strange, quiet bravery that lives in alleys and speaks in whispers. And perhaps in our own lives, there are still rats. still creaks in the walls, still shadows in the corners of our days. We may not carry a sack or set traps, but we each have something we must face. Something small, unwelcome, and persistent. And when we do let us think of them, the nameless ones who stood when no one else would. So rest easy tonight. The rats for now are quiet. The streets are still. The trap is set. And somewhere deep in the folds of history, a man with soot on his hands and sharpness in his eye nods in your direction. This has been your humble narrator, Silas Whitmore. And if this tale kept you company, or even just gave your thoughts something to wander toward, why not leave a comment with the number 1? And if not, well, do the noble thing and click like anyway. It's what keeps the ghosts of rat catchers smiling. Until next time, sleep well and beware the scratching in the walls.